What if your depression isn't a flaw to fix, but a message your psyche is begging you to hear? Hi, I'm Jim Rohn, and in this video we're going to look at depression and cynicism from a perspective you've probably never heard before, but one that might change the way you understand yourself forever. Because here's the truth. Most people don't talk about sometimes what we call depression isn't about a chemical imbalance or a personal failure. It's a grieving process, but not for a person, for an ideal. A version of life, of ourselves, of the future we thought we'd have, that quietly slipped away while we weren't looking. Cynicism. That might not be bitterness, it might be disappointment in disguise. And if we don't pause to ask, what did I lose that I haven't let myself grieve, we risk staying stuck, frozen, disconnected from our own inner truth. In this video, we'll explore how depression and numbness can actually be signs you're carrying unprocessed grief, what it means to audit your ideals, and why it's one of the most powerful emotional tools you'll ever use. The subtle but life-changing difference between letting go of a dream versus letting go of the strategy to get it. And how honest reflection, not toxic positivity, creates real emotional relief and growth if you've been feeling heavy, directionless, or quietly hopeless. This isn't just another think positive pep talk. This is an invitation to get curious about your pain and find what it's trying to tell you. So stick with me. And if you value conversations like this, conversations about deep emotional truth healing and human resilience, hit the subscribe button. I post videos every week to help you navigate life with more clarity and courage. Now let's get into it. One of the most powerful tools you can use to work through emotional heaviness, especially when you're feeling depressed, disconnected, or cynical, is something Heidi Priebe calls the ideal audit. Now, this isn't about fixing yourself or slapping on positive affirmations. It's a practice of emotional honesty. It's about looking at the quiet expectations you've been carrying, the old dreams or identities that might have made sense at one time, but are now keeping you stuck. And the truth is, many of us are holding on to ideals we don't even realize we've outgrown. They sit in the background of our minds like outdated blueprints, quietly shaping how we see ourselves and the world until something inside us starts to break under the weight of them. The ideal audit invites you to stop and ask, what version of life was I secretly planning on? What identity was I trying to maintain? What did I hope would happen? And what part of me can't let go of the fact that it didn't? These aren't easy questions. They take courage, because once you name what's really behind your sadness or numbness, you can't pretend anymore. You can't keep going through the motions and blaming yourself for feeling off. You start to see that your depression might not be dysfunction. It might be disappointment, grief, a quiet mourning of something you never got or never became. This is where things start to shift. When you do an ideal audit, you're not trying to be hard on yourself. You're not digging for failure. You're just bringing awareness to what your inner world has been carrying without your full consent. And once it's in the light, you can finally grieve it. You can feel the sadness of what didn't happen, not because you did something wrong, but because life moved differently. And in that grief, something important happens. Space opens up. Emotional clarity begins to return. You stop clinging to what should have been and start asking, what now? What do I need in this chapter of my life, not the last one? Here's the powerful part: when you're willing to grieve an old ideal, you're also making room to dream again, but from a place that's grounded in who you are now, not who you thought you had to be. You can stop chasing goals that no longer reflect your truth. You can begin to live in alignment, not performance. And that's what healing really looks like. It's not about finding a fix, but about reconnecting with clarity. So if you're feeling numb, cynical, or tired in a way that rest doesn't fix, try this sit down with the questions from the ideal audit. Ask yourself gently, what am I still holding on to that no longer fits? Then listen, not with judgment, but with curiosity. You might be surprised by what comes up. And more importantly, you might finally begin to release what's been quietly breaking your heart so you can start living with your whole heart again. One of the most insightful metaphors I've ever come across for understanding depression comes from a peer counseling training. It goes like this. Imagine someone sitting in front of a giant beige wall, but all they can see is a small black square in the center. That black square becomes their whole world. It's all they're focused on. It's not that the rest of the wall doesn't exist. It's just that in that moment, they genuinely can't see anything else. That's what depression feels like. It narrows your view. It shrinks your sense of possibility. And more than that, it convinces you that the darkness you see is all there is. Now, here's the important part. The role of the therapist, or really anyone offering support, isn't to walk in and say, "Hey, it's not that bad. Look, the wall is beige." That doesn't help. In fact, it usually makes things worse. Because when someone is stuck in that narrow focus, being told that things are fine or not as bad as they seem can feel invalidating. It suggests that their pain isn't real, or that they're simply seeing things wrong. That's not how you help someone who's depressed. The goal isn't to tell them what they should see. It's to sit beside them long enough that their view can gently begin to expand on its own. Depression isn't always about sadness. Often it's about constriction in thought, in emotion, in possibility. You stop seeing options. You stop believing in alternatives. You lose access to the part of yourself that knows how to imagine, to dream, to trust in change. And when you're in that state, you don't need solutions thrown at you. You need presence. You need curiosity. You need someone who says, "I see the black square too. Let's just sit here for a while." And when you're ready, maybe we can look around together and see what else is there. The same goes for how you treat yourself when you're in a depressed state. It's easy to get frustrated with your own mind. To say, "Why can't I just snap out of this? Why can't I see the good?" But that approach only deepens the isolation. The healthier move is to say, "Okay, this is where I am. My focus is narrow right now, but that doesn't mean the rest of the wall is gone. It just means I can't see it yet." That kind of self-awareness creates room for gentleness, and gentleness is often the doorway back to clarity. Sometimes the breakthrough comes not from fighting the black square, but from accepting its presence without letting it define your reality. The moment you realize this isn't the whole story, it's just what I can see right now, you've already started expanding your perspective. You've already created space for something new. And that space, that breath of awareness, is often where healing begins. Grief is something we often misunderstand. We tend to associate it only with death, with the loss of someone we love. But grief is much broader than that. It's not just about losing a person, it's about losing possibility. It's about losing the version of the future you thought you were building. The job you thought would define your purpose. The relationship you thought would last forever. The version of yourself you were trying so hard to become. And when those things fall apart or fade away, grief is the natural human response. The problem is most of us never stop to recognize it as grief. We call it burnout or depression or feeling lost. We distract ourselves. We push forward. And in doing so, we block the very process that could help us heal. Heidi Priebe reminds us that grief isn't something to be avoided. It's something to be honored. It's a signal that something mattered to us, that we had hope. That we invested our energy and belief in something that didn't go the way we planned. And rather than rushing to replace that lost future with something new, rather than telling ourselves to move on or be strong, the first step is to simply acknowledge what's been lost. That acknowledgement is painful, yes, but it's also powerful, because the moment we stop denying our grief, we start making space for something honest. When you allow yourself to fully grieve, you're not wallowing, you're witnessing. You're standing still long enough to let your body, your heart, your nervous system catch up to the reality you've been resisting. And in that stillness, you begin to feel. Maybe it's sadness, maybe it's anger, maybe it's deep confusion. That's okay. All of those emotions are part of the process. They're not problems to solve. They're waves to move through, and the only way out is through. One of the reasons we struggle so much with this kind of grief is that we weren't taught to see it as real. Society doesn't give us rituals for grieving the life we didn't get. There's no funeral for a dream, no eulogy for who you used to be. But that doesn't make the grief any less valid. In fact, the more invisible it is, the more it needs to be named. Because once you name it, once you say, I'm grieving the version of me who thought she'd be married by now, or I'm grieving the future I thought I was working toward, you reclaim a kind of emotional dignity. You stop gaslighting yourself into thinking you're weak. You start giving yourself permission to be human. And here's what's so counterintuitive about grief: when you stop running from it, it softens. It becomes less like a wall and more like a window. It opens something in you. And in that opening, there's room for growth, room for new possibilities. But you can't force that stage. You earn it by allowing the old version of your story to break your heart, and by being willing to stand in the pieces long enough for something real to emerge. That's how we heal. Not by skipping over grief, but by walking through it step by honest step. There's something quietly destructive about the truths we don't say. Not just the things we don't tell others, but the things we don't even admit to ourselves. Heidi Priebe explains that when we push down key emotions, especially the inconvenient ones like resentment, disappointment, jealousy, or grief, we don't just make them disappear. We split ourselves. We create a kind of internal conflict between the part of us that feels the truth and the part of us that's trying to suppress it. That inner tension doesn't go away. It shows up as anxiety, depression, cynicism, or burnout. And the longer we avoid the truth, the louder those symptoms get. A lot of people think they're doing the right thing by staying silent about their pain. They say things like, it's not a big deal, or other people have it worse, or I just need to push through. But those are not acts of strength. They're acts of survival. And survival strategies, while necessary at times, are not sustainable for emotional health. If you constantly deny what's true for you, especially because it feels selfish or inconvenient or too messy, you slowly disconnect from your own inner world. And once that happens, it's incredibly difficult to feel at peace. Because deep down, some part of you knows you're not being honest. That's why self-expression, real, raw, emotional honesty isn't about drama or self-indulgence. It's about integration. It's how you stop splitting yourself between the version of you that plays it safe and the version that knows what's actually going on. And you don't have to make some big public confession to start. You just have to be willing to tell the truth to yourself. I'm not okay right now. I'm still angry about what happened. I wanted something more than I admitted. These are not dangerous statements. They are honest ones. And honesty creates alignment. It creates relief. Because when you're honest with yourself, even about painful feelings, you stop resisting reality. You stop wasting energy pretending. And that frees up space in your mind and body to actually deal with what's there. Instead of being stuck in a loop of denial, you get to make real choices. Maybe you stay. Maybe you change direction. Maybe you ask for help. But now you're moving from truth, not from avoidance. That's the turning point. We all carry unspoken truths, and often they seem small at first. But over time, they build pressure. And if you're not careful, they'll show up in ways you don't expect. Irritability, disconnection, chronic exhaustion. That's why emotional honesty isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. It's how you stop betraying yourself just to keep the peace or avoid discomfort. So, if something inside you feels off, don't ignore it. Don't minimize it. Start by being curious. Ask, what am I not saying out loud? Not for the sake of confrontation, but for the sake of clarity. Because when you live in alignment with your truth, you stop fighting yourself, and that's when the real healing begins. Letting go is often misunderstood. We think it means giving up on the dream entirely, letting go of the goal, the vision, the thing we hoped for. And sometimes that's true. But more often, what we really need to let go of is the strategy, the method we've been using to try to reach that goal. And that distinction matters. Because you can still want love, purpose, connection, or freedom. But if you're using outdated or dysfunctional strategies to chase those things, you'll end up frustrated, exhausted, and emotionally stuck. That's where a lot of suffering comes from, not the goal itself, but the way we've been going about it. We all develop strategies early in life, coping mechanisms, patterns of behavior, even personality traits that help us survive. Maybe you learned that being nice, agreeable, and self-sacrificing got you attention or approval. Maybe you learned that being in control or staying emotionally distant kept you safe. Those strategies probably worked at some point. They were your way of navigating an environment that didn't feel emotionally secure. But the problem is we don't always update them. We carry those old strategies into our adult lives and relationships, expecting them to deliver the outcomes we want. Deep connection, real intimacy, mutual respect. But they don't. And instead of re-evaluating the method, we often double down. We try harder. We give more. We tighten our grip. And then we wonder why things still feel so hollow. Grieving in this context means being honest enough to say, this way isn't working anymore. It means looking at the role you've been playing, whether it's the fixer, the people pleaser, the perfectionist, the avoider, and asking, is this actually serving me? That's not a betrayal of who you are. It's an invitation to grow. You're not letting go of your goal. You're letting go of a way of being that's keeping you from reaching it. This kind of shift requires humility. It's uncomfortable to admit that what once felt like strength is now holding you back. But it's also empowering. Because the moment you release the old strategy, you make room for something better, something more aligned with who you are now. You stop chasing connection through performance. You stop managing love through control. You stop proving your worth through over-functioning. And you start building relationships and a life that are based on truth, not tactics. Letting go of the strategy is about recognizing that you no longer need to protect yourself the way you used to. You've grown, you've changed, and it's okay to choose a new path, even if it means grieving the version of yourself who needed the old one. That grief is real, but it's also healing. It allows you to move forward with clarity, not confusion. So take a moment and ask, what have I been doing that no longer works? What am I ready to release, not because I failed, but because I've outgrown it? That kind of honesty opens the door to freedom. And in that freedom, you'll find a new kind of strength, one that doesn't need to prove anything, because it finally trusts its own truth. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you, not just for watching, but for staying with yourself. Because the ideas we've explored today aren't light or easy. They ask something deeper from you. They ask you to stop pushing past your pain, to stop treating depression, cynicism, and emotional heaviness as problems to fix, and to begin seeing them as signals, as invitations to grieve, reflect, and grow. We talked about how depression is often not dysfunction but a narrowing of perspective, like seeing only a black square on a wall and forgetting the rest of your life even exists. We explored how unspoken truths can create quiet internal tension and how being honest with yourself, even about inconvenient emotions, is the beginning of healing. We looked at the ideal audit, a simple but powerful tool to uncover the dreams or identities you may be holding on to long after they've stopped serving you. We also explored the kind of grief that doesn't always have a name, the grief of letting go of the strategy, not just the dream, because sometimes what needs releasing isn't your goal, but the outdated method you've been using to try and reach it. Letting go in that way isn't failure, it's maturity. It's the beginning of emotional freedom. So here's the real takeaway. Your depression and cynicism aren't signs that you're broken. They're often signs that you're ready to grow beyond an old version of yourself. They're asking you to slow down, look inward, and tell the truth about what's no longer working, what you're still grieving, and what you're starting to want now, even if it scares you. If that message resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we unpack emotional truths like this to help you build more clarity, self-respect, and inner strength in your life. And if you're comfortable, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this conversation hit home for you? What ideal are you in the process of letting go? Thank you again for being here. I'm Jim Rohn, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay honest, stay kind to yourself, and remember, clarity comes not from avoiding the pain, but from walking through it with your eyes open.